So next up, thank you very much, you guys, for that. So now that groups have had time to share, what we would typically do is we would repeat this process. So if we had multiple quotes that we were using, we would do it multiple times. So if you were in a classroom with, maybe even a second rich text that you wanted to use, you could do it that way. But we're going to instead move to the final step for our purposes. And the next, so round 2, I'm gonna just flip through this. Okay, so now the reporters, so this last round is reporters are going to report to the whole class, or in our case, our whole group, the major themes, significant ideas, and lingering questions. So it's always a good idea, especially because we are limited in time, to set times for these kinds of things. Depending on your group, you might have people who really like to talk a lot, and you might end up losing time for those last groups to go. So timers, if we get timers for each group to set the time for 2 minutes for that share. And do we have a group that wants to volunteer to go first?
You can go first.
Deontay did a wonderful job giving me bullet points because he was our reporter.
All right.
But maybe not 2 minutes worth. Okay. So we spent a lot of time talking about the social pieces of a discussion that are absent in discussion forums. And so one of those would be in-person cues, but also the kinds of relationships that we develop because of physical proximity in a classroom space. And we even noted, who stayed behind. And it was our group, people who were sitting together. And so then how do these relationships, if they are formed outside of the class, inform the discussion board relationships? Are they a necessary piece to having sort of a thoughtful interpersonal exchange in the discussion board, which would be an argument for like a blended type format rather than a purely online format? But in the case that that's not possible, we were wondering how is it that the online format, if it's used exclusively, might be marginalizing particular groups of students, which the article also talked about. So what exactly is the marginalizing mechanism? What is doing it? And we talked about, Kate mentioned language, right? So certain kinds of language are privileged in different settings, and certain students have the cultural capital to use certain kinds of language, and it feels more permanent and codified if it's written in a discussion form than it might be if we're sharing in class, because there's a written record of how we're thinking, speaking, using language. So that might be alienating, is something we're thinking about. So that's a lingering question. One of the other major themes, we got a little hung up on if you can fall in love online, then you can learn history online.
Yep.
And as a group, we discussed, again, that relational piece. It's easier to fall in love online than it is to maintain a relationship online. It's probably easier to fall in love with history online than it is to maintain a relationship long distance with history over time. So we were wondering, what can instructors do to maintain that engagement over the long period of time? And as Deontay said several times, it often falls to the instructor to make sure that they've set up the class in that way.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, I am lucky enough to be the reporter for our group. Nobody wanted to take over the job. Weird, like nobody. So we talked a lot about, I would say, Suki brought up like the notion of open-ended questions. Like, again, kind of maybe in reference to what you guys said as well, the idea of the instructor and the design of the questions and the sort of conditions, setting the conditions in a way that are actually allow students to feel safe and also give students something to talk about and kind of create those dynamics. So I think that was also something that was really important that we talked about. And we also talked about that human component with the falling in love online, and had, I think, a really good discussion about like the feeling that I often have of pushing back against that, and why some of us, myself particularly, feel sort of old school about what it really means to be in discussion and be in community, and can you have that? And Brian was a really great person to have in our group because of his feeling that is possible, that learning is happening and discussion is happening in all different kinds of ways that we have, I think, yet to acknowledge, or maybe even yet to just sort of be able to really fully appreciate and understand. So for us, I think it was a lot of just kind of tearing it down a little bit, looking at what limits us in our ability to understand it, but also, the structures that are important. Did you guys want to add anything else? No. Okay. Good. So if we were in a larger class, of course, we would have multiple groups, and we could then take from this and chart it on the board. That's something that I often did as an instructor, was that I would chart for students what the results, what the takeaways were, or collect reporters' notes, have a collective space where reporters can sort of dump all their notes together and let students see what were the larger themes, and the larger themes that came out of a whole class discussion as a way to kind of really boil down not just what's in the article, but also what we took from it, what meaning we as learners made from it, which is a really, really important part of the components of discussion, the reason for discussion. When I was prepping for this, I looked at a lot of articles that talked about what are the benefits of discussion, why do you want to do it in a classroom, and that's sort of one of them, that idea of bringing in sort of people's personal experiences and making it sort of more real in their lived lives, the content that we're teaching, especially when you're talking about things like technology. And that was something we talked about, the idea of the way we think about technology sometimes is outside of emotion, it's outside of sort of feeling. And so being able to do that for your students and create a space where they can transcend some of that thinking is important. So good, thank you very much. So that's the protocol, right? So you can take students through a protocol like this. You can do that, we did this in 40 minutes. You can do it in a shorter amount of time. You can reduce times. It depends sort of on what your dispositions are and desires. The discussion project does a whole bunch of different protocols. It shows faculty and instructors a lot of different protocols that they can do, and also talks people through some of the problems that come up and why discussion is really sort of challenged. And this is maybe kind of off the script a little bit, but I'm actually curious, what do you guys think, how do discussions go in your classes? Most of you are master's or PhD level students. How do they go in your classrooms?
Mine really depends on, I think, how the professor structures it. There are some.
But people who often see me in class, I'm super laid back and I just, am the observer until I have a point to make. So I think, classroom climate and culture are very important things to look at, but also just not expecting one person to talk about one lens that they might have a perspective of.
Yeah, I like you bringing up having students talk off of something, right? That's a bad way to do it. I don't like having any discussions in my classes where I didn't ask the students to bring something that we're going to start from, right? There's just something physical that we're going to start this conversation from, and you're not starting from flat, you got to pull it out of your butt, right now, dude. Okay, no, you've thought about this before class, and I used to ask everyone, okay, so what did you write about in your journal? But I stopped that for a different reason. And I would just do impromptu lectures based on it. It was a good way to get all of us to see where we were all at. And students go, okay, we're all confused about this, not just me, right? But I would have them we started from something that they brought, and they brought so many cool pieces of their own background in that I wouldn't have known otherwise. So
I actually think, I hope that at some point you guys get a chance to do the discussion project. I think one of the things that is really great about it as an educator and as a researcher is looking at the ways that this project, and for some of you who I know I've talked a little bit about the project with, the ways that it actually gets at access and community on our campus. I think that when people think about campus community at UW, they think of Bucky, right? Or the Badgers or whatever. And think it's still going. Doing this project really made me think of, oh, it's so much smaller than that, right? It's in classrooms where you either bring students in and make them feel part of the campus community, or you leave them out, especially as this campus works to create equitable spaces that aren't tokenizing people, spaces that aren't making people feel fearful, right? Spaces where people are feeling like their own true selves are part of the learning. And so I think it's got a really cool potential to do that. And so, I encourage you, if you get an opportunity to sign up. So the sign up is at the discussion project. If you even Google just the discussion project, UW-Madison. And for those of you who got my email, you saw I put the link in there. I don't know if they're doing any more rounds this semester, but they have them next semester. I think the only recommendation or requirement is that you have to be like teaching in some capacity, but if you're TAing or you are doing instruction in that sense, I think it counts, and they go through and sort of pick out the people that they can see will be having the most impact on students. So yeah. So the other thing I want to say before I go, especially for those of you who like this protocol itself maybe was something that was new to you or was interesting, the only last thing I have on the slideshow is, and this is something when I was sharing this protocol with student teachers, I shared with them, and they still didn't follow the directions when they did their own discussions. But it was good that they didn't follow the directions, because then they saw why each of these components are so important. And also it gets to what some of you guys are even saying goes wrong in your discussions in your classrooms. So for people who are teachers and know how this works, this is a review, but for people who haven't necessarily done a lot of instruction, there are 4 like major things that I would always say if you're gonna create a discussion. You wanna make sure you post clear directions. So you don't want to have students, especially in small group discussions like this, saying like, what are we supposed to do? Where are we going? It sort of loses its effectiveness. People start feeling a lack of confidence. So having directions really clearly spelled out, and also providing rich text. Provide them something that there's a lot to talk about, not just something that's kind of gonna, be like a real brief in and out, something that has a yes, no kind of answer to it. So a rich text that will promote discussion. And assigning jobs, I already told you, I have a big belief in that. I used to do it with my high school students, I do it with college students, and when I do facilitation of professional development with adults, I do it as well. I also have a little pet peeve in classrooms where professors say things like, find a partner and discuss. Because that fear that often comes along with classroom settings, like I'm triggered by that. Like, who am I supposed, is he gonna talk to the person on his other side? Is she gonna, and I'm gonna be the weird one in the middle? So I always like to even take it as far as saying like, number people off. If you're gonna have people partner up, say you two, you two, you two, just to kind of build in a sense of comfort, especially at the beginning. And then communicate expected outcomes. Like, what do you want people to get out of this? Like, what is the actual takeaway that you are hoping that they will get from it? And then just overall, in sort of a larger sense, structure. The worst kinds of conversations or discussions that I have witnessed or been part of are when people are just riffing. And that's when you get a lot of these really dangerous situations where people say things that are misunderstood, and you have a breakdown of like communication and respect in a classroom. And so it can be like a really a bad setup for people. So good. All right. Thank you very much, you guys. I really appreciate it for you guys staying. Okay, thanks. Okay.